David says, I can shout first about God's presence. When I see him correctly, things get in line. I can shout not just about his presence, I can shout about his promise. His promise is that when I call on him, he'll hear me and he'll save me. But thirdly, he says, I can shout because I trust his protection. Verse 7, there it is right there. David says, I can shout because in the midst of my fears, I can still feel him moving. Right there in verse 7, what does it say? The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers him. I'm done when I tell you this. When you put your trust in God, he'll get you out of whatever situation you're in. Will you help me close real quick and just look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, if you trust in God, he'll deliver you. Now you're going to have to help me preach. Now look to your other neighbor and say, neighbor, if you trust in God, he will deliver you. That's the good news of the text. David started off fearing for his life, but ended up fearing God and receiving protection. Notice how he delivers you. The Bible says he encamps around you. And I wish I had time to deal with it. But you remember the three Hebrew boys. Them three Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had been great in the eyes of King Nebuchadnezzar. But one day he makes a decree and says, I don't care who you are, how great you are. When you hear the sound of the music, you need to bow down and worship me. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, nope, I'm not going to worship you when I hear it. And you know what happened after that? The king brought them to him and said, well, I hear that you've decided to be disobedient. They said, yeah, we're not going to bow down. And the God, our God, even if you throw us in the fire and he doesn't rescue us, just know he's still able. Well, the Bible says that Nebuchadnezzar went ahead and threw them into the fire. Threw them in the fire, but when they got into the fire, the Bible says he looks back and in astonishment says, didn't I throw 3 men in the fire? He says, I'm looking and it looks like there are 4 men walking around unbound, unchained. And he said, the 4th man looks like the Son of God. What are you trying to say, Ivey? I'm just trying to tell you that when you trust in God, he will deliver you. And the way he delivers you is he might not always pull you out of it, but sometimes he'll jump right in there with you. And you'll go through fire. You'll go through fire and you won't smell like you've been burned. You'll go through fire and you'll look like you hadn't been burned. Is there anybody in here that can testify? There's some times in my life that I've gone through fire. Hold on 1 second, Doc. I'm almost there. There have been times that I've gone through fire in my life and I came out not looking like what I've been through. You ought to look at your neighbor one more time. I know you're tired of looking at him, but look at him one more time and just say, neighbor, I don't look like what I've been through. That's something good to shout about. I don't look like what I've been through. Somebody ought to just say, keep on trusting God. I said, keep on trusting God. Storms may come, winds may blow. But whenever you find yourself in a bad situation, you ought to pull out your hymn book. And you ought to say to yourself, I trust in God. Wherever I may be, out on the land or on the rolling sea. Is there anybody here that can testify that trusting God will protect you? Is there anybody here that can testify the more you put your trust in God, he's came through for you? And I'm so glad that trusting God may not always get me out the situation, but it pulls them closer into the situation with me. Is there anybody here that knows about the grace of God? I'm closing when I tell you a story about Native Americans. They had this ritual called the rites of passage. And when a man turned 13 years old, they would take him out into the wilderness and tell him that in order to grow up, you're going to have to survive this wilderness all by yourself. And what they would do is they would blindfold him and leave him all night long in the dark. And you know this boy was in the wilderness and he had the blindfold over his eyes, and he could hear the sound of the wind blowing. He could hear the sound of the leaves rustling all over, and he could hear the sound of the wolves and the animals howling all around him. And he got terrified, ready to give up and ready to quit. But after a while, he felt the rays of the sunlight on his face, and he knew it was morning. And so he took his blindfold off and began to look around. He was still here. He looked around, and in the far distance, he could see a warrior standing with the bow drawn, ready to attack. And as he got a little closer, he learned that it wasn't just a warrior, but it had been his daddy watching him all night long. And I wonder, is there anybody here that's grateful that your daddy watches over you? I don't know about you, but is there anybody here that can testify? I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within, seeking to rise no more. But the master of the sea, he heard my despairing cry, and from the waters lifted me. Now safe am I. I wonder, is there anybody here that can celebrate the goodness of God, that can say, even though I mess up, God's still been good to me? Is there anybody here that can testify that even when I dropped the ball, God's still been good to me? Is there anybody here that can say, I've been sick in my body, but he's healed me? Is there anybody in here that can say, I almost lost my mind, but it kept me? Is there anybody in here that said, I wanted to throw in the towel, but God picked me up and turned me around? Can I borrow your hand just one more time? You want to turn to your neighbor and grab their hand this time. Come on, grab your neighbor's hand and say, neighbor, I got a word for you. I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what you've been facing, but I got a word for you. And that word is, be not dismayed. Whatever betide, God will. I said, God will. Is there anybody here that knows God will take care of you? If you believe it, say yes. Say yes. Say yes.
Regional shout. We thank God for Stephen Ivey, Reverend Stephen Ivey, for that powerful word from God. And the reason why we have something to shout about, the Bible says that God loved us so much that he sent his only begotten Son that to die on the cross, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. The Bible simply says that all you have to do is to confess with our mouth and believe in our heart that Jesus Christ did live, that he died, and yet God rose him from the dead, and thou shalt be saved. The doors of the church are now open.